When working with interfaces, we're forcing the implementation of our contract details here. So everyone who implements the iDamageable interface needs to include a damage method. Well, one of the things polymorphism allows us to do is create what's called many forms. So here we have void damage and we're forcing an int parameter. But alternatively, what if you had a purpose for your game where you had void damage and you wanted to pass in a float parameter? Well, through the use of polymorphism, it allows us to have many forms and do just that. So by doing that, I can actually go to my enemy here, and you'll see here that, our main class, and you'll see here that when I call that damage method, I will now have the ability to choose whether or not I want to pass in an int or a float. So object.damage, and now we have one of two options. I can pass in a float or an int. So that's how working with polymorphism allows you to basically have several different forms. Alternatively, what we could do is we can create a generic interface. Now, this is definitely more advanced, but one of the things we could do in our iDamageable contract is we can say, let's let the class that's implementing this interface determine if it's going to be a float or an int. Instead of having, say, 50 different damage methods here with, say, one is going to take GameObject and one's going to take int and float, what we can do is we can create a generic type that lets you define what you want to do. So let's say our player is going to deal damage in ints and our enemy is going to deal damage in floats. Instead of having two different contracts and forcing the implementation of that, we can get into a generic type where I can say public interface iDamageable, and we'll open up some T brackets and we'll put in a T. The T keyword is going to signify that it's a generic type. Now, once we do that, we can then go to our void damage method. I'm going to delete the float, and we're going to replace the int here with type T. So whatever you specify when you implement this contract is going to be that type. So here, you'll see here that if we go to our enemy, it's going to be read on iDamageable as well as player. And the reason for that is because it's using the generic type requires one type argument. So for our player, it's going to implement the int functionality. So I'm going to say iDamageable and then T, and I'm going to put in the type. I'm going to say int. That means that my damage method must be of type int. For the enemy, I'm going to say, let's say GameObject or float if we wanted to, but I'm going to do GameObject just to show the extreme difference. So iDamageable of type GameObject, that means that our damage method here needs to be of type GameObject for the parameter. And you'll see here that as this condition matches what's in the T brackets, it's now satisfied. So then you'll see here it's going to give us some errors because you can't subtract the GameObject from a int property. So that is working with generic type interfaces, and it's very useful when you have different and many forms, and you can basically sum it up to where let's let the developer determine what that form is because they're going to be writing the implementation. So I'll see you guys in the next video.